Computers are amazing, and how a computer works is really quite wild. And we're going to be exploring all of that. Let's take a look at what this course is all about. We're going to kick this course off by getting into what is a computer. We're going to define what a computer is and what are the primary functions that a computer carries out. And we're going to start talking about the components of a computer. What are the different components that make up the computer? And we'll take it not just from a hardware perspective, but also the software. We'll talk about different categories of software like system software and applications and how it plays a critical role in your computer's operation. And we'll take a look at different types of software that's on your system that's needed, such as what is a driver. Next, we're going to get into a module of how do computers work. Now, you don't necessarily need to know the nuts and bolts of how a computer operates, but I like to go over it because number one, it's pretty cool stuff. And number two, it gives us some perspectives on why computers operate the way they do. So we're going to get into some details like what is a transistor, what's an integrated circuit, what's a microprocessor, and how has microprocessors changed over time. And we're going to do a little project of how can we create a calculator using these little micro switches. So we'll talk about the different gates that we have, whether it's an AND gate, an OR gate, and how we can assemble those into some sort of circuit so that way we can do things like add two bits together. Once we have an understand of these ones and zeros and how computers can calculate things using these ones and zeros, then we're going to get into how do computers use these bits? How do we represent different aspects that we need to represent inside the computer? And when it comes to representing different characters or graphics, we need to represent that by a certain amount of bits. Well, how do you determine how many bits that you need? Well, it boils down to the powers of 2. So we'll get into the powers of 2 and how we can represent different combinations using a certain number of bits. We'll talk about some standards when it comes to measurement out there because it's not all the same and it can get a little confusing on which system is being used in which applications. And we'll get into Unicode and ASCII and how they represent different characters. For instance, ASCII represents different characters using 7 bits. And we'll get into how we can represent different colors of a pixel and how we use those pixels to create a picture. And how pixel art isn't the only type of graphics there is out there. We have both raster and vector graphics, and we'll talk about the difference between the two. And we'll get more into the CPU, the central processing unit, and how it processes bits. We'll also get into how we've reached a plateau in the speeds of our processors. And so what we do is we actually have other ways that we can process more information. And we'll talk about the different methods that we use to do that. Then we're going to get into different things that compute. We're going to talk about a bunch of different equipment out there and how it does computing. We're going to get into things like what is a mainframe, we'll talk about PCs, we'll talk about Macs, but we'll also take a look at a lot of different types of equipment. For each one, I've created a little note card so that way we can compare and contrast what are these different computing devices. And we'll get into things like virtual reality versus what is augmented reality. And we'll also get into the Internet of Things. And we'll actually be taking apart some of these computing devices to see what's inside of it. And in the end, you're going to see computers in a whole different way and how we interact with computers on a day-to-day basis. And we're going to create this solid foundation that you can build off of any future knowledge because you're going to have this core understanding of how computers function.